I buried my brother in April, and by June a man I had met exactly twice was informing me, with the particular smooth confidence of someone who has already decided how a conversation will end before it begins, that Daniel's considerable gambling debt had become, in his own peculiar arithmetic, my marriage contract instead. My name is Charlotte Reyes, and I was 25 years old that summer, the sole surviving Reyes on 400 acres of good grazing land in the Texas hill country that my father had built from nothing and my brother Daniel had inherited outright 3 years before, on account of being the elder and the only son, an arrangement I had accepted at the time without much protest, since I had never particularly wanted the burden of ownership, only the home itself, which Daniel had always been generous enough to let me consider equally mine, in every practical sense that mattered. Our father had died of a fever the winter I turned 19, and our mother had followed him within 2 years, worn down, I have always believed, by a grief she never properly let anyone see the full weight of. Daniel had been 23 when he took over the operation, restless in the particular way of a young man who inherits responsibility before he has fully finished growing into the character required to carry it. And I want to be honest that I had watched, over those 3 years, a certain looseness develop in how he managed both the ranch's accounts and his own evening habits in town. A looseness I had raised with him gently on more than one occasion, and had generally been met with his easy, deflecting charm, rather than any real change in behavior. Daniel died in April, thrown from a horse on a stretch of road he had ridden 1,000 times before, in circumstances that struck several people in the county, myself included, as considerably stranger than a simple accident, though nobody had ever produced evidence sufficient to call it anything else officially. I had spent the 2 months since his funeral learning, piece by uncomfortable piece, exactly how much of my brother's charming, restless energy had been spent at Bartholomew Sledge's gambling tables in town, and exactly how much money had changed hands in the process, a sum considerably larger than our ranch's modest annual income could have covered in several years of careful saving. If I did not find some way to properly dispute Bart Sledge's claim on that debt, I stood to lose considerably more than money I did not actually have. I stood to lose the ranch itself, since Sledge had made it plain, through the particular careful legal language men like him always seemed to have ready access to, that marriage to me was the only settlement he would accept in place of a debt he insisted the ranch's own income had originally been pledged against, an arrangement he claimed Daniel had agreed to verbally, in the particular kind of private conversation that leaves no witnesses and no paper trail beyond one man's word against a dead man's inability to dispute it. I had spent the better part of 2 weeks, before Owen ever came to me with his ledger, trying every avenue I could think of on my own to dispute Sledge's claim, writing to a lawyer in San Antonio who informed me, politely but firmly, that without documentation of my own I had little practical recourse beyond simply refusing and awaiting whatever legal action Sledge might attempt. Action his own careful ambiguity about the debt's precise terms suggested he was in no great hurry to formalize through an actual court filing, since a filed claim would have required him to specify exactly the terms my own instinct already told me would not survive close examination. Owen Garrity had worked as our ranch's foreman for 6 years by that summer, hired originally by my father and kept on by Daniel with the particular unquestioning trust my brother rarely extended to anyone else, on account of Owen's quiet, thorough competence at exactly the kind of detailed record-keeping Daniel himself had neither patience nor aptitude for. Owen had come to us from a family further east that had lost their own smaller operation to bad debt when he was young, a fact he mentioned only once, in passing, during my father's lifetime, and never elaborated on further, though I had always privately suspected it explained a certain careful, methodical thoroughness in how he approached every aspect of the ranch's finances, as though he had personally witnessed, once, exactly what carelessness with money could cost a family. Owen kept the ranch's actual books, the honest accounting of cattle sold and feed purchased and wages paid, separate from whatever careless mental arithmetic Daniel conducted at Sledge's gambling tables, and it was Owen who came to me, 3 days after Sledge's first visit, with a ledger of his own that told a considerably different story than the one Sledge had presented. I kept a private record of every advance your brother took against the ranch's credit these past 2 years, Owen said, laying a worn ledger book on our kitchen table, with the particular careful precision of a man who understood exactly how much weight the document he was presenting actually carried. Sledge's figure includes markers your brother settled honestly, in cash, that Sledge appears to have simply not crossed off his own books, along with at least 2 hands of cards I personally watched him deal from the bottom of the deck on nights your brother was too deep in his own drink to notice properly. I looked at that ledger for a long moment before I found my voice properly, turning through pages of Owen's careful, small handwriting, dates and figures, and a handful of witness names noted alongside specific evenings, the particular thoroughness of a man who had clearly been documenting this quietly for considerably longer than my brother's death had given him reason to. You watched him cheat my brother, I said, and said nothing for 2 years. I said something, Owen said, and there was a particular controlled steadiness in how he said it that told me this admission cost him something considerable to make. I told Daniel plainly, more than once, exactly what I'd seen. He didn't want to hear it. A man losing money to a rigged game generally doesn't want to be told he's a fool for continuing to sit at the table, and your brother was proud in ways that made honest counsel considerably harder to give him than you might expect. When did you first suspect it? I asked. The cheating itself, rather than simply the losing. Close to 2 years back, Owen said. I'd gone into town on ranch business and stopped at Sledge's place for a drink while I waited on a supply order, and I watched him deal 4 hands in a row that came out considerably more in his own favor than simple chance would generally allow. I mentioned it to Daniel that same week, careful as I could manage, and he laughed it off, told me I didn't understand cards well enough to judge such things properly. I let it go for a time after that, telling myself it wasn't my place to keep pressing a grown man about his own choices, though I've had considerable occasion since to regret that particular restraint. You couldn't have stopped him, I said, though I want to record that I was working out, as much for my own benefit as for Owen's, whether I actually believed that or was simply offering the kind of comfort one offers by reflex. Daniel was not a man who took correction easily from anyone, myself included. I'd raised the same concerns with him, gentler perhaps, and gotten the same easy deflection you did. Perhaps, Owen said. I've turned it over considerably since his death. Whether a harder word from me at the right moment might have changed anything. I don't know that it would have. But I decided, once Sledge came around demanding marriage as settlement, that I wasn't prepared to make the same mistake twice, staying quiet out of some notion that it wasn't my place to speak plainly when it mattered most. I did not tell Owen, that first evening, how much his admission had shifted something in my understanding of my brother's final months, the particular guilt I had been quietly carrying since the funeral, wondering whether I had failed to notice something I should have caught in time to prevent whatever had actually happened on that road in April. I want to be honest that the guilt did not fully lift that evening, or for considerable time afterward, but Owen's ledger gave it, for the first time, a shape I could actually examine rather than simply carry blindly, and there was, I found, a particular relief simply in understanding that I had not been the only person in Daniel's life who had tried, imperfectly, to steer him away from the particular recklessness that eventually cost him everything. Bart Sledge returned to the ranch the following week, arriving with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never once, in his considerable experience, encountered a debt he couldn't eventually collect through patience alone. I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my proposal, Miss Reyes, he said, seated in our own front parlor with the particular presumption of a man who had already decided the outcome. I'm not an unreasonable man. Marriage settles the debt in full. The ranch continues operating exactly as it has, and you retain considerably more dignity in the arrangement than a foreclosure and public auction would afford you. He gestured slightly with one ring-heavy hand, as though the matter were already a formality awaiting only her signature. I understand grief clouds a person's judgment in the early months. I've been patient on that account. But patience, Miss Reyes, is not an unlimited resource, even in a man of my particular disposition. I've had time to examine your figures more carefully than you perhaps anticipated, I said, and I want to record that my voice held steadier in that moment than I actually felt, though 5 years of managing a household through my mother's death, and then my father's, had taught me, at minimum, how to keep my hands from shaking even when the rest of me wanted to. Mr. Garrity kept an independent record of my brother's actual dealings with your establishment these past 2 years. It does not match your own accounting, Mr. Sledge, by a considerable margin, and I have reason to believe the discrepancy traces directly to certain irregularities in how your games were conducted. Something moved across Sledge's face in that moment that was not quite alarm, but was considerably closer to it than the smooth confidence he'd arrived with, and I understood, watching it happen, that Owen's careful 2 years of quiet observation had just become the single most valuable document in this entire dispute. I don't know what your foreman believes he witnessed, Sledge said, his voice carrying a new edge underneath its previous smoothness. But I'd caution you both against making accusations of cheating you can't properly substantiate in front of a county judge who's known me and my establishment for considerably longer than either of you has lived in this county. A man's reputation in this county carries weight, Miss Reyes. Weight your foreman's word alone is unlikely to overcome. Then perhaps we should let the county judge examine both ledgers side by side, Owen said, stepping forward from where he'd been standing near the parlor doorway, his voice carrying the particular quiet firmness I had come, in the space of 1 week, to understand as his version of drawing a line. I've got dates, hand counts, and witness names for 4 separate occasions, Mr. Sledge. I'd wager considerably more than the debt in question that a proper judge finds my accounting the more credible of the two, particularly once he speaks with the men whose names I've written down alongside each date. Sledge stood then, gathering what remained of his composure with the particular practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to controlling rooms, though I noted his hand trembled slightly as he retrieved his hat from where he'd set it. "This isn't finished," he said, in the particular tone men like him always used when a conversation had, in fact, very much just finished in a direction they hadn't planned for. "I rather think it might be," Owen said, and did not move from the doorway until Sledge's wagon had disappeared down our road. I want to be honest that the days following Sledge's visit were not simple, whatever satisfaction I took in watching his composure crack in our own parlor. The county judge, a careful man named Whitfield, who had known both Sledge and my own family for considerably longer than either was entirely comfortable discussing, took the better part of 2 weeks reviewing both ledgers, interviewing witnesses Owen had quietly cultivated over 2 years of careful, patient observation, before ruling that Sledge's claimed debt was inflated by nearly half through demonstrable irregularities in how at least 4 specific hands had been dealt, and that the remaining, legitimate portion of Daniel's debt would be settled through a modest payment plan drawn from the ranch's ordinary annual income, with no claim whatsoever on the land itself. Judge Whitfield's ruling made specific note, in the written decision Owen later read aloud to me at our own kitchen table, that Texas homestead law had never actually permitted gambling debts to be secured against land held under federal claim in the first place, a fact Sledge's careful legal language had been counting on my grief and unfamiliarity with such law to obscure entirely. The ruling further noted that a verbal agreement, unwitnessed and made in circumstances where one party was demonstrably intoxicated, carried considerably less legal weight than Sledge's confident presentation had implied, and that his insistence on marriage as settlement had rested on exactly the kind of intimidation the law existed, at least in theory, to guard against. Owen read that portion of the ruling twice, I recall, the second time more slowly, as though he wanted to be entirely certain I had properly absorbed each word of it, and I understood, watching him do so, that he had perhaps worried, in the quiet of his own private accounting, whether I fully believed myself free of Sledge's claim until I heard the county's own considered judgment confirm it in language even Sledge's lawyers would struggle to dispute. "I owe you considerably more than thanks," I told Owen, the evening the judge's ruling reached us by messenger, both of us standing at the same kitchen table where he'd first laid out his ledger 3 weeks before, the paper still warm from the messenger's saddlebag between us. "You could have said nothing, Owen. You could have let Sledge collect his debt the easy way and gone on drawing your wages, same as always, without any of the risk you took standing in that parlor. Sledge is not a man inclined to forget who stood against him publicly, and I understand well enough that you've made yourself a considerably more visible target in this county than you were 3 weeks ago." "I could have," Owen agreed. "I considered it, briefly, the evening Sledge first came around asking after your brother's estate. I decided fairly quickly that I wasn't prepared to watch a man collect a debt built partly on cheating a dead man who could no longer defend himself, particularly not when collecting it meant taking considerably more from his sister than any honest accounting actually owed." "That's not quite an answer to why you took the risk personally," I said, rather than simply telling the truth and letting the chips fall where they would without further involvement. "You could have given your ledger to the judge directly and stayed out of that parlor entirely, Owen. Instead, you stood in that doorway and put yourself between Sledge and whatever he might have done in that moment if he'd had less sense than he apparently does." Owen was quiet a moment, and I watched him do the particular careful work of a man who had spent considerable time keeping his own feelings as tidily filed away as the ranch's accounts, now finding the filing considerably harder to maintain. "I've worked this land 6 years, he said finally. "I watched your father build half of what still stands, and I watched your brother, whatever his failings, genuinely love this place even when his own judgment failed it badly. And I've watched you, this past 2 months, hold this ranch together with considerably more steadiness than most men in your position would have managed, grief or no grief." He looked at me directly then, in a way he generally didn't allow himself. "I wasn't going to stand by and let Sledge take that from you over a debt half of which was never honestly owed to begin with. Call it loyalty to your family, if that's the easier explanation. I'm not certain, myself, that it's the whole of it." I did not ask him, that evening, to clarify what the rest of it might be, though I want to record that I understood, standing at that table, considerably more of his meaning than either of us said plainly at the time. Bart Sledge left the county within the year, his gambling hall's reputation for rigged games having spread, in the particular way such things spread once a county judge has officially confirmed them, considerably faster than his own ability to rebuild trust with a new set of customers. I never learned where he eventually settled, and I found I did not particularly care to know. Owen Garrity and I were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the same ranch house where he had first laid his careful ledger on my kitchen table, and I want to record that when he finally spoke plainly about the rest of what he hadn't clarified that evening after the judge's ruling, it was considerably simpler than either of us had expected the confession to be. Delivered at the same fence line where he'd once shown me, years before as merely our foreman, how to properly read the health of a herd from its grazing patterns alone. I should have said this considerably sooner, he told me, that evening at the fence. But I've never been a man who found words easy, particularly the ones that mattered most. I love you, Charlotte, and have for longer than either of us probably realized while I was still simply your brother's foreman keeping his books in order. I told myself, for a long while, that saying so would have been improper, given the difference in our positions on this ranch, and I let that particular caution keep me quieter than I probably should have been. I'd worked that out somewhere around the parlor confrontation, I said, though I appreciate you finally saying it plainly rather than making me guess indefinitely. I'll confess I'd begun to wonder whether you intended to spend the rest of your natural life keeping careful ledgers and never once mentioning the considerably more important account you were apparently also keeping. He smiled then. The rare, full smile I had come to understand was reserved for exactly these moments, and took my hand at that same fence line where 6 years of quiet, careful loyalty had finally found its proper words. We combined our lives in the practical, unhurried way two people do, who have already spent considerable time understanding each other's habits before ever calling the arrangement a courtship, and I found the transition considerably smoother than either of us had privately worried it might be. Owen continued keeping the ranch's books, openly now, rather than in careful private observation, and I found myself, in the years that followed, taking a considerably more active hand in the operation's daily management than Daniel had ever particularly encouraged, a partnership that suited us both considerably better, I came to understand, than the more traditional arrangement most of our neighbors maintained. I still keep Owen's original ledger, the one he brought to our kitchen table that first difficult evening, in the same drawer where my father once kept the ranch's founding papers. And some evenings, watching Owen work the same books at that same table, now openly rather than in careful private observation, I understand more clearly each year that the truest kind of loyalty rarely announces itself loudly. It simply keeps honest records, year after quiet year, and waits for the moment those records finally matter enough to speak for themselves.